Chapter 5 Lessons of Light. Silas laid in his tent, listening to the gentle flow of the river pass by him. Crickets and other insects chirped in the distance. A soft pitter-patter of a light rain fell upon the canvas of his tent. Typically, a night this peaceful would have lulled him into a deep sleep, but there was too much on his mind for sleep. He pondered all that had happened to him over the past couple of days, the trip to the ancient crypt, the discussion about finding the rest of the elemental stones, the crazy vision he had seen, not to mention that he had almost conjured light magic already. True, he hadn't cast any spells yet, but he was surprised at how fast he was able to tap into his inner life and almost open his second mind. Still pondering why fate had chosen him to find the amulet and embark on this crazy journey, Silas thought that he heard something crack off in the distance. He sat up slowly and strained his ears, trying to filter out the gentle rain on the canvas and the flowing water behind him. He heard another sound, this time a rustling of leaves that sounded like they had been stepped on by a wet boot. Silas held his breath and slowly positioned himself on his knees and crawled over to the door flap of his tent, then with one finger pulled the fold of the door open just enough that he could peer out into the darkness. It was a light moon year, so even though the moon was only about 3/4 full tonight and there was a slight cloud cover, he was still able to see with only some slight limitations to visibility. 4 figures were slowly walking in the shadows, their silhouettes just barely noticeable. He wasn't able to see much detail, but it looked like they were looking for something. Maybe they're bandits, or friends of Uthran? Silas doubted the last thought. Uthran would have told them if he had friends coming to meet them. Not knowing what to do, Silas reached for his short sword that was lying just inside of his tent door flap. He steadied his breath as he quietly unsheathed the blade. The prospect of actually using it against another person terrified him, but he needed to be ready for anything. Looking around to try and determine if it was just the 4 of them, Silas noticed another figure crouching right next to Torin's tent. Silas squinted his eyes upon the character and then realized that it was Torin. He must have been awake and heard them walking around too. Torin turned his head and looked right at Silas. He slowly put a finger up to his mouth and began to stand up. Silas could see that Torin was also holding his sword and that he had already put his boots on. Silas swallowed, unsure if he was ready for what was surely soon to come. He quickly re-entered his tent, pulling his boots upon his feet with shaky fingers. Just as he was finished lacing them up, he heard a brave yet scared yell enter the night air. Scrambling out of the tent, Silas looked up to see Torin exchanging blows with his sword against one of the dark figures, the other 3 charging towards him. Silas jumped to his feet, charged towards his friend, screams of confusion and a plea for help escaping his lips. One of the figures stopped running at Torin and turned towards Silas. Silas readied his sword and gritted his teeth. The man charged towards Silas, raising his sword and swinging it down at his head. Silas was barely able to bring his sword up to block the blow in time. Their swords clashed and bounced off each other, sending a loud ring throughout their camp. The man brought his sword to his side and swung out in an arch, this time aiming for the chest. Silas jumped backward, barely dodging the blade in time. Lifting his sword for the counterattack, he swung his blade at the man's upper arm. The man parried the sword away as if it were a stick and slashed again at Silas. He tried to dodge it, but it came down with too much speed and caught Silas on his left forearm. The blade sunk deep into his arm, burning like he'd just dipped his arm into liquid fire. Pain coursed through his arm, forcing him to drop his sword. Blood poured out of his arm and into the ground, mixing with the rain and mud. The man lifted his sword to deliver the killing blow. Silas helplessly lifted his right hand into the air, as if to block the sword with his hand. "Say goodbye, boy," the dark-robed figure said, rain dripping down an evil smile. The man swung his sword down at Silas with a yell, but the sword stopped just before making contact. A glowing yellow sphere surrounded Silas, its warm energy radiating over his body. The sword, unable to penetrate the shield of light, bounced off unexpectedly and put the man who wielded it slightly off balance. Silas looked to his left and saw Uthran standing with his arms stretched out towards him, his eyes and hands glowing with the same color as the sphere. "Uthran!" Silas yelled. Raindrops glowed yellow as they fell around the powerful mage. He looked back down at his arm, the pain almost seeming to subside ever so slightly at the presence of his protector. The man's stunned look turned into a scowl as he pulled his sword back into a fighting position and turned to face Uthran. Uthran looked at Silas and instructed him to find Samara and hide. "Don't come out until I call for you. Do you understand?" Silas nodded, forcing himself to stand and push through the pain in his arm. Adrenaline surged through his body as he splashed through the rain and mud in search of his friend. A curious eye turned several times to focus upon Uthrin. The man tilted his sword, looking at Uthrin with disgust, then spat at his feet. "You have something that we need. Give us the stone, and we'll be on our way." Completely ignoring the man, Uthrin pulled his hands in towards his body and cupped them at his side. The shield that was protecting Silas dissipated as he saw a ball of light appearing in Uthrin's hands. With a yell, Uthrin extended his hands out in front of his body, shooting a bright beam of light towards the man. It rippled through the air with incredible speed, and before he even had time to blink, the light beam pierced him in the chest and it exited his back. A gaping, cauterized hole sat where his chest cavity once was, allowing the light of the moon to shine right through his body. He fell to his knees, splashing muddy water into the air. A deathly wheeze joined the pattering of rain as he slowly tipped forward, falling face first into a dark puddle. Turning from the sight of the corpse, Silas put his hand over the gash in his arm, trying to stop the blood from exiting as much as he could. His mind was swirling with the loss of energy, but something deep down within forced him to continue. His eyes found Torin, still locked in combat with one of the other intruders. Their blades danced in the night, clanking against one another in a deadly display. Torin surprisingly looked to have the upper hand. He swung at the man's leg with his sword, then threw his left fist at the enemy's face. The man was able to block the sword, but didn't see the fist coming. Torin struck him right in the jaw, causing him to stumble backward. Torin took this opportunity to bring his sword back around and jab at the man's side. He parried the blade just in time, then took another swing at Torin. Torin blocked the sword, but the man continued with added fervor, swinging with increased speed left and right. Torin was barely able to keep up, parrying the blade, but each time losing more and more ground. Rain splashed off dark robes as a black blade quickly changed positions, striking at Torin's head. Torin was quick to react, but not quick enough to avoid a swift shoulder as it slammed into his chest. The blow sent Torin sprawling backward onto the ground, a splash of muddy water rising into the air to meet the rain. Torin reached for his blade that had fallen from his hands into a puddle, but the man introduced his muddy boots to Torin's chin with a swift kick, sending him back to the ground. "Torin, no!" Silas screamed, running towards his friend. The man placed his muddy boot upon Torin's chest, then lifted his sword high above his head, thrusting it down with a yell towards his heart. Just before the blade penetrated Torin's chest, a slightly glowing vine from a nearby tree sprang forward and wrapped itself around the sword. The man grunted and struggled against the vine as he looked around in confusion. A deep green glow penetrated the darkness to his side. Silas spun his head to the source, his eyes landing upon Geode. Geode expertly spun a wooden staff, cracking it against his enemy's head, then spinning it to block the attack of his second opponent. He held one arm extended towards Torin, controlling the vines with twitching fingers. His eyes and hands glowed with a deep forest green, causing the rain around him to appear as tiny falling emeralds. He commanded the vines to throw the sword to the side, then wrapped themselves around the man like a woody serpent, starting at the ankles and working their way up around his body. As if he were able to see in two directions at once, Geode expertly swung his staff with one hand, twirling it with astounding speed. He blocked incoming blades, parried their attacks, and smacked his attackers with spinning movements. His staff whirled in the wind before cracking against one of the man's arms, then swiftly returned to block a blow sent at his back. Geode pivoted and spun his staff above his head several times before slamming it down once again. Glowing, emerald-like rain continued to fall around him, his dark black hair glistening in the light of the moon above. His attackers stood absolutely no chance. A flash of light to his left pulled Silas's attention. Uthrin was engaged with several other dark figures, yellow light magic filling the air as he quickly incapacitated them. The growing number of enemies confirmed to Silas that he had obviously not seen all of them when first peering out of his tent. Torin rubbed his chin and pushed himself to his feet. His long hair dripped over the front of his face as his mouth dropped open. "Silas, your arm!" "I'm fine," Silas replied, the amazement of his two mentors in battle almost causing him to forget his wound. "Come on, we have to find Samara." Torin sent a quick glance towards Uthrin and Geode. Yellow and green light glowed around them like strange auroras in the night. Enemies fell around them like flies. No hope for the forces of evil tonight. Torin nodded, springing to his feet and joining Silas as he ran towards Samara's tent. Wind whipped past their ears in the night as they sprinted through the rain, their eyes scanning the darkness for other intruders hiding in the shadows. "Please let her be okay," Silas kept repeating to himself. "Please let her be okay." Approaching the tent, Silas watched as a dark shadow slipped inside the door flap. "Samara, watch out!" Silas and Torin both yelled in unison. They heard a scream coming from the tent and redoubled their speed. Moments later, they came crashing through the canvas entrance where they saw a man holding Samara with a knife at her throat.
"Don't come any closer, or the girl gets it."
Samara whimpered at his gruff voice, tears running down her face as her body shook with fear. "Help me," she whispered in a choked voice. "Let her go," Silas yelled, his voice cracking slightly.
"I said stay back. Now, unless you want Sweet Cheeks Ear to get it, you're gonna do exactly as I say. Back out of the tent, now!"
Silas and Torin hesitated for a moment, not wanting to comply.
"Did I stutter? I said back out!"
The man pressed the knife firmly against Samara's neck, drawing a bead of blood. "Okay, we're going," Torin said, raising his hands. Keeping their eyes fixed upon Samara, they both backed out of the tent slowly.
"Hang the door open so I can see you leave,"
the man instructed, keeping the knife firm against Samara's neck. Torin drew the door flap open and secured it to one of the main frame poles so that it would stay open.
"Now, keep moving."
Torin and Silas continued backing up until they were out of the tent. The man exited the tent, keeping a tight hold on Samara.
"Now, one of you's got the stone, yeah? Bring it to me, or I'll slice her neck."
"What stone?" Torin said, trying to delay for as long as possible. "There are rocks all over the place. Just pick one out yourself."
"Don't play games with me, boy. I know you have it. The Stone of Darkness. It's all I need. Give it here, or she dies."
The man's eyes widened. He jumped backwards, tightening his grip around Samara.
"Stay back. I'm warning you."
Taken aback by the sudden movement, Silas turned around and saw both Uthrin and Geode approaching them. They had finished off the other men, and still had the power of magic glowing in their eyes and around their hands. Samara's body was shaking involuntarily, her eyes pleading for help as she gazed upon her two protectors. "Help me." A dry squeak slipped from her throat.
"Stop. Not a step closer,"
the man said, pressing the knife against Samara's neck even harder, drawing more blood.
"I'll kill her. Don't think I won't do it. I'll kill her dead."
Uthrin and Geode stopped walking, hands slowly rising in a defensive position.
"It's going to be okay, Samara,"
Uthrin said, slowly pointing a finger towards her. A bright glow of magic radiated at the tip of his finger, sending yellow reflections into the falling drops of rain. A bright yellow light appeared around Samara, covering her body with the protective light energy that Silas had seen Uthrin use on him just moments before. The man gritted his teeth.
"I warned you."
He twisted his body, slicing his knife across Samara's neck. "No!" Silas and Torin both shouted. Samara's scream filled the air as the knife slid across her neck. Instead of falling to the ground in a destroyed heap, Samara remained standing, a bright flash of yellow light around her neck acting as a protective barrier. Uthrin then raised both his hands high above his head and pulled them down, causing a brilliant beam of light to descend from the sky. A boom that sounded like it had descended directly from the heavens smote the man with holy power. His grip on Samara released, and the knife fell from his hand. He took a step backward, then fell to the ground, incinerated by the deadly beam of light magic. Samara ran to Uthrin, tears flowing down her cheeks as she wrapped her arms around him. Uthrin returned the hug, and the light from his eyes and hands faded into the night.
"Are you all right, Samara?"
he asked softly. She nodded and wiped the tears from her eyes. I think so." Relieved, Silas released a breath of air he had been holding, then feeling lightheaded, looked back at his arm. The giant gash continued to pour blood onto the ground, his arm now completely numb. Stars glittered in his vision as he fell to his knees, trying to resist the urge to faint.
"Silas!"
Uthrin exclaimed. Kneeling down beside him, he again made the symbol of light and his hands and eyes began to glow. He placed his hands on Silas's arm, causing Silas to scream in pain. Resisting the urge to pull his arm away from Uthrin's hands, light began to circle around his arm and enter into the giant gash. He felt the same warmth that he had felt when attempting to conjure light magic earlier that day. The heat entered his arm, and he instantly felt the pain start to subside. The blood stopped flowing from his arm onto the ground as his arm muscles began to weave themselves back together, working their way up towards the outer layer of skin. Finally, his skin pulled itself together, leaving a long white line where the blade had penetrated. He looked with astonishment at his healed arm. The pain had completely left. The only sign that he had ever been injured at all was the thin scar that he now wore. Uthrin tended to Samara, healing the small cut that she had on her neck, then proceeded to ask Torin if he needed any healing. Torin simply shook his head, his senses still completely overwhelmed at the terrifying action that had just taken place. Uthrin nodded, and the yellow glow left his eyes and hands. He then turned and looked at the man in the distance who was still wrapped up in vines.
Let's find out exactly who these people were. We need to know who sent them, and how they know we have the stone.
They all walked over to where the man was lying on the ground. He struggled against the vines that held him captive, but to no avail. Geode made the symbol of nature with his hands and resumed the dark green glow of magic. He stretched out his hand, and the vines around the man tightened around him, lifting him into the air so he was floating upright, just slightly off the ground. Uthrin walked up to the man and with an open palm slapped him across the face.
Who are you? Who sent you to find us?
The man spat at Uthrin.
Do what you want. I ain't talking.
A strange look flashed over Uthrin's eyes. It was as though he were casting holy judgment upon the evil that the man had just tried to perform. He made the symbol of nature, and just like Geode, his eyes and hands began to glow a dark green. He raised his hand into the air, then clenched it into a fist. A small thorn sprouted from one of the vines wrapped around the man's chest, poking outwards away from his body.
It would be a shame if more of these thorns were to continue growing from these vines, but inward instead of outward,
Uthrin said, his voice cold. The man swallowed, but his resolve held firm.
Do your worst.
Uthrin's face tightened as he held the gaze of the man. Rain continued to fall, a low rumble of thunder in the distance. He raised his fist, then slowly started to squeeze. Several small thorns sprouted out from the vines that wrapped around the man's chest and arms. They pierced into his skin and continued to grow. The man shrieked in pain, a bead of sweat forming at the top of his forehead as his breathing rapidly increased.
The thorns will continue to slowly grow in size until you are skewered like a kebab. Now, tell me, who are you and who sent you here? Was it Melos himself, or do you work for one of his puppets?
The man tried to hold firm, biting down hard against his lip as he endured the agonizing pain. A slow screech left his lips as he arched his back slightly, the pain too much to bear.
All right, I'll talk. Make it stop.
Uthrin waved his hand, and the thorns that pierced the man's body retreated. Red spots of blood began to mark the man's clothing where the thorns had exited.
Gah!
The man spat, his breathing heavy.
My name's Raymond. I'm part of a band of thieves called the Black Hand. We've worked under Melos going on 10 years now. We were stationed at an encampment just outside of Shilverst when we got word from the Dark Mage that the Stone of Darkness had been moved. He told us that he'd had a vision that the stone had been taken from its hiding place. Told us it was crucial he get it back. He commanded us to retrieve it and bring it to him at any cost. We went to Shilverst searching for clues when we got word that he'd seen another vision. He said the stone was near the river to the east.
The man grimaced again from the pain that the thorns had left in his body.
That's when we found your camp. Figured it was you'd had the stone. No one else for miles and miles. Has to be you.
The man stared deeply into Uthrin's eyes.
We're just his minions. The ones that happened to be closest to where the stone was when he felt it. He'll send more. He can feel where it is. He'll send powerful mages, ruthless warriors more skilled than us.
His face darkened with hate and malice as he spat the next sentence.
You won't survive the onslaught that he'll send. He will get the stone, and then he'll bathe the world in darkness.
He's already done that, genius, Torin mocked back at him. The man chuckled.
Nah, being the supreme ruler of Evandrel isn't his end goal, boy. He needs it back. He needs it back. He's still yet to unlock his full potential. He's not done till he's become the ultimate and immortal ruler of the world.
Torin's eyes widened, but he played it off as cool as he could. Pfft, immortal. Looks like you chose the wrong side, buddy. It's not going to happen. The man tipped his head back, a hideous laugh exiting his throat.
You don't know the half of what's going on. His power is limitless. He'll find a new hiding spot for the stone until the time is right. He'll continue building up his armies until no one can stand in his way. The world as you know it'll be...
The vines started squeezing Raymond tighter and tighter. He wheezed out in pain, unable to finish his monologue. Silas heard the sickening cracking of bones as his wheezing scream turned into nothing but a gurgling whisper. A loud crack followed, and Raymond's body fell limp. The vines dropped his lifeless body to the ground, and retreated back to the tree from whence they sprang.
"Geode,"
Uthrin spat almost angrily.
"I wasn't done."
"We heard enough, Uthrin," Geode said as he lowered his hand. "There wasn't anything else useful he could tell us. Besides, if Melos really knows the general whereabouts of where we are, then that means I need to leave for Silvers to warn them now, and return to you as swiftly as possible. If he's going to continue to send people to hunt us down, you'll need me here." Uthrin still looked frustrated, but agreed.
"You're right, as usual. Leave for Silvers right away. We'll await your return here. I'll keep the others safe."
Geode nodded, turning towards the town of Silverst.
"I'll be as fast as I can. But if I'm not back by tomorrow night, you must go without me. There will be others that can keep you safe in Gelendor, and it would be much safer there than in the middle of the wilderness." "We will wait for you, but we will leave if it becomes too dangerous to wait," Uthrin responded. "Meet us just a bit further down the river when you return. I'd like to move away from this battle scene in the morning." Geode looked up at the moon. The rain was slowly starting to let up as patches of clouds began to part themselves to allow the moon to shine down upon them. Turning, he hurriedly jogged off towards Silvers. Silas looked back down at the now almost unnoticeable scar on his arm. "It's only been 1 day and half of a night since we left home, and I've already almost died." Uthrin saw the concern on his face and walked up to Silas, putting his hand on his arm. "It should be as good as new by morning. Light can't get rid of all the scars, but some, if healed quickly, will fade until it's like they were never there. You did well, Silas." He then looked at Samara and Torin. "You all did well. I'm sorry that we've already run into trouble. Try to get some sleep if you can. I'll keep watch for the rest of the night. We shouldn't be too far off sunrise." Looking off into the distance where Geode had left, Silas asked, "Will Geode be all right on his own?" "Geode is one of the most skilled warriors I have ever met, Silas, not to mention a powerful and deeply knowledgeable mage. He can take care of himself. Now, you three go get some rest. I'll teach you how to heal with light magic in the morning, while we wait for his return. I can already see that this will be quite necessary for you all to learn." Looking back at his scar and then to Torin and Samara, who both nodded, Silas agreed and started off towards his tent. Samara, still shaken from the night's events, opted to stay awake with Uthrin. Silas didn't see his sword on the way back to the tent, which made him nervous, but the knowledge that Uthrin was keeping watch calmed his nerves. He crawled into his tent and laid down on his back. Closing his eyes, he thought of his family back in Silverst, pleading to the gods above that they were all safe.